My name is Wes Williams, Professor Wes Williams. I'm the director of Torch, and it's my enormous pleasure to welcome you all here today. And I should start by saying that you're all very brave. This is the first of the in-person Book at Lunchtime events that we've been able to do since the pandemic began. So we're very pleased that you're here. You've just mentioned that it's the first time you've seen me in real life, as opposed to on a screen. And we're all having that strange experience of being sort of in the presence of others. It seems at least minimally relevant to today's title, where we're no longer spying through a glass darkly at each other or spying through a screen, but actually meeting in person. And it's, as I say, an enormous pleasure for me to be able to say that the first of these then is with Professor Cecile Fob and her brilliant book. I'm about halfway through, as I said, on the ethics of espionage and counterintelligence today. I should also say that very rudely after introducing this, I'm going to have to run away because there's another in-person event going on with staff within the humanities that I need to go to. But before leaving you to this discussion, I should just say that Book at Lunchtime is one of Torch's flagship events. It's a fortnightly bite-sized discussion of a recently published book by an Oxford author. And again, now, as of today, the bite-sized discussion carries on with some bite-sized lunches. And its principal function is to bring together authors, researchers within Oxford, with others within Oxford in a sort of multidisciplinary space, as well as people from beyond this university, to test out ideas. Because we believe that once an idea has become a book, it's not finished. It's still got its work to do. Even though as an author myself, when I've written something, I think, okay, I've done that now. That's actually never true, because it obviously the books, the ideas, the words go other places, and we're never quite in control of those other places. And part of the scary bit of the Book at Lunchtime is finding out what other people think of what you've written. But that's also the joy of it and the challenge of it. To chair today's session, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Brianna Rosen, who's Senior Fellow at Just Security and a Visiting Fellow of Practice at the Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict. She's a former career civil servant with a decade of experience working on US national security and Middle East policy issues. It doesn't come much harder than that. During the Obama administration, she was assigned to the White House National Security Council and Office of the Vice President. Prior to government service, Rosen worked at several leading research institutes in Washington, D.C. She's currently completing a DPhil in public policy at this university, where she is a Clarendon Scholar. And with that, I'll hand you over to her very capable hands and hope that you enjoy the rest of today's session.
Thank you, Wes, for organizing this timely and important event. Good afternoon and welcome to the Torch Book at Lunchtime discussion. It's a real pleasure to be with you today to discuss Cecile Fob's powerful book on the ethics of espionage and counterintelligence activities. Let me start by introducing our author and my fellow panelist. Professor Cecile Fob is Professor of Political Philosophy at the University of Oxford and a Senior Research Fellow in Politics at All Souls College. Her research spans theories of distributive justice, the philosophy of democracy, just war theory, and the ethics of foreign policy. She is currently working on the ethics of the transition from war to peace, following her prolific other publications, including Economic Statecraft, Human Rights, Sanctions and Conditionality, Cosmopolitan Peace, and of course the classic text, Cosmopolitan War. Dr. Elod Uzon is a Marie Curie Fellow at the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Oxford and a Junior Research Fellow at Corpus Christi College. His research sits at the intersection of moral, political, and legal philosophy. His current project deals with the moral constraints on and legal limits of self-defense, as well as the ethics of risk-taking and risk imposition, theories of harm aggregation, and the influence of epistemic uncertainty on moral decision-making in war. So without further delay, I would like to invite Cecile to read a passage from her fascinating book, which I'll note is currently available to purchase through Oxford University Press, Amazon, and many local bookstores.
Thank you very much, Brianna, and thank you to all of you for turning up this afternoon. I'm very grateful to Torch for organizing this event on the book, and to Brianna and Elad for agreeing to share their thoughts. I will read several passages which I will weave, together into some sort, of narrative, beginning with the very famous passage from St. Paul's letter to Corinthians, which I used to give the book its title. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as I also am known. The book is about what we, that is to say citizens of political communities and leaders who act on our behalf, are morally permitted and obliged to do in order to procure the information we need in the domain of foreign policy and war in the face of third parties' wish that the information should remain unavailable. And that question, which is the question of espionage, has a counterpart, to wit, what we are morally permitted and obliged to do in order to thwart outsiders' attempts to procure information about us which we want to keep secret from them. These two questions are at the heart of, respectively, espionage and counterintelligence. In both war and peace, we see only through the glass darkly. Our foes and friends' aims and intentions are worryingly opaque to us, as we want ours to remain opaque to them. When we spy on our foes and friends, we do not merely find out who they are and what they do, we expose ourselves to the risk that they too will uncover our secrets. As we polish the glass in order the better to see them, we enable them the better to see us, and thus the better to threaten us. That, in a nutshell, is the dilemma which we, as well as intelligence agencies, face when they engage in espionage and counterintelligence activities. We always will need spies, and here I turn to, from St. Paul's letter, I turn to John le Carré. Here is what he has to say in The Secret Pilgrim. Why spy? For as long as rogues become leaders, we shall spy. For as long as there are bullies and liars and madmen in the world, we shall spy. For as long as nations compete and politicians deceive and tyrants launch conquests and consumers need resources and the homeless look for land and the hungry for food and the rich for excess, your chosen profession is perfectly secure. I can assure you. So this is in the context of a speech delivered by Le Carré's iconic character, George Smiley, to a generation of recruits. Developing, as I try to do in the book, an ethics of espionage and counterintelligence is morally problematic for the following reason. Intelligence officers deceive, bribe and or manipulate their targets as a means to get the information they want. They exploit their vices and vulnerabilities. They encourage them to deceive their colleagues, friends, spouses and children, indeed to commit treason. They are ordered by their masters to do all of this and are paid for it. No wonder espionage, for all its glamorous James Bondish trappings, has a bad name. No wonder it feels dirty. And yet, as I argue in the book, espionage and counterintelligence are morally justified, under some circumstances, indeed, are morally mandatory. Here, I draw on a strand of Western political thought, which argues along those lines. Actually, I've just misspoken, not just Western political thought. In fact, we find in the writings of the great Chinese military strategist and general, 6th century BC, Sun Tzu, a ringing endorsement of the use of spies. Spies, we are told in the concluding chapter of the book, are, I quote, a most important element in war because on them depends an army's ability to move. War is so costly to the sovereign's soldiers and subjects, particularly his poorest subjects, that he is under an obligation to try and shorten it by acquiring knowledge of the enemy's intentions and dispositions. And given that the only way to acquire such knowledge is by using spies, a sovereign who refuses to use spies, notably on the grounds that they are too expensive to maintain, is, and here I quote directly from Sun Tzu, completely devoid of humanity. We also find an argument for the obligation to use spies under the pen of Thomas Hobbes, and arguably the greatest English political philosopher ever, 17th century. Hobbes argues in his book on Citizen or De Cive that the sovereign is under an obligation to use spies. He thinks of spies along the lines of an analogy with spiders. Spies, he writes, are as necessary to the safety of a commonwealth as rays of light to the safety of man. Or we may use the analogy of spiders' webs, whose incredibly fine threads spread out in all directions and convey outside movements to the spiders sitting in their little cavities inside. Without intelligence agents, Hobbes tells us, verbatim, sovereigns have no more idea what orders need to be given for the defense of their subjects than spiders can know when to emerge and where to make for without the threads of their webs. Princes are obliged by the law of nature to make every effort to secure their citizens' safety. It follows not only that they are permitted to send out spies, maintain troops, build fortifications, and to exact money for the purpose, but also that they may not do otherwise, as Sir Hobbes tells us. Now, you will have noticed that there is no suggestion in what I have read from Sun Tzu on the one hand and what I have uncovered from Hobbes on the other hand, that the moral status of the ends to which spies are deployed makes any difference to the permissibility and obligatoriness of espionage. And I'm going here to use, so I shall not read from the text verbatim. Instead, I'm going to use an entirely topical example to illustrate the point. It's not in the book because the book was written long before the war in Ukraine started on the 24th of February. On Sun Tzu, this is really important. On Sun Tzu's and Hobbes' view, President Vladimir Putin is under as stringent an obligation to deploy his intelligence agents for the sake of pursuing his war in Ukraine as President Biden, Prime Minister Johnson, President Macron, and so on are under an obligation to deploy their own intelligence agents. Indeed, as President Zelensky is under an obligation to deploy his own intelligence agents for the sake of stopping Russia's war in Ukraine. This, however, is so even if we may assume for the sake of argument President Putin's war in Ukraine is unjust insofar as it is a war of aggression, while efforts to block that war are morally justified. One of the key claims that I make in the book is the claim that, on the contrary, the moral status of the ends which governments seek to pursue when using espionage is absolutely crucial to our moral appraisal of those espionage activities. I happen to believe, I don't think I'm going out on a major limb here, but I happen to believe that President Putin's war in Ukraine is not just unlawful, but unjust. It is an unwarranted war of aggression. I happen to believe that President Zelensky's war of self-defense in Ukraine is a justified war of self-defense. On the view that I articulate in the book, President Putin is not morally permitted to use his intelligence agencies as a means to procure information that would enable him to continue to pursue his unjust war aims in Ukraine. By contrast, President Zelensky and his allies are morally permitted to use their own intelligence agencies in order to get the information they need as a means to stop President Putin's war, of aggression. Furthermore, and that would be my last claim in these introductory remarks, I also argue in the book, and in this respect I agree with Sun Tzu and Hobbes, that A leader who is morally justified in carrying out espionage activities as a means to stop violations of fundamental rights is also, under certain conditions, under a moral duty to do that. However, whereas Sun Tzu and Hobbes argue that the ground for a leader's duty to resort to espionage and counterintelligence lies in that leader's own citizens' safety, so that he owes them a duty to spy, I argue that that duty is also owed to innocent civilians on the other side who will be harmed, by our leaders. My understanding, therefore, of the duty to spy is broader, and in that respect, it is a more demanding, understanding than the one that we find, in the writings of Sun Tzu and Hobbes. Defending an ethics of espionage and counterintelligence is not easy. The means by which intelligence agencies get the information we heard from Le Carré are very often morally problematic: deception, manipulation, exploitation, encouraging the other side to commit treason. As I argue in the book, nevertheless, under some circumstances, these are morally justified, indeed morally obligatory means to conduct those activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cecile, for that incisive introduction. Let me preface my remarks by saying that as someone who has spent a decade working on national security issues, Cecile's book is unique in that it is both highly illuminating from a philosophical perspective and instructive for policymakers and intelligence professionals who must grapple with the ethical dilemmas it raises. For the most part, my time in government was spent working under the Obama administration, an administration that, similar to the current Biden team, prided itself on pursuing a morally directed approach to U.S. foreign policy. But early on, the administration was forced to grapple with a number of ethical challenges arising from issues ranging from the so-called global war on terror, the drone program, indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay, to Edward Snowden's revelations concerning mass surveillance, to the acceleration of cyber espionage and cyber warfare activities. All of these policy issues and many other besides involved intelligence operations in some fashion. Every morning, the president and his senior advisors received what is called the President's Daily Brief, the PDB for short, a packet of curated intelligence analysis and raw reports on crises and conflicts around the globe. By mid-morning, crucial decisions were made based on that information, including decisions to kill, sanction, and otherwise inflict harm on individuals or groups. Cecile's inquiry into the ethics of espionage and counterintelligence, then, particularly what is morally permitted or even required to do to obtain intelligence information, plays an extremely salient role in ensuring the morality of foreign policy decision-making overall. We are limited in time here, so I cannot begin to address all of the ground that Cecile deftly covers, but I do want to highlight some key themes that I hope will encourage you to peruse the book at greater length. Admittedly, it does not make for light summer reading, but it is nevertheless quite thrilling for the philosophically inclined. The overarching thrust of the book is that individuals have a right to secrecy to the extent that it protects their security, democratic agency, and economic rights. This right, however, like other rights, is subject to certain limits. Individuals may not do whatever it takes to acquire or protect secrets. Cecile argues persuasively that espionage and counterintelligence activities are morally justified as a means, but only as a means, of thwarting violations of fundamental rights or the risk thereof, subject to the constraints of necessity, effectiveness, and proportionality. In pursuing these intelligence activities, some actions which seem presumptively wrongful, such as blackmail, manipulation, and eavesdropping, may at times be morally justified. More controversially, Cecile contends that some intelligence activities are morally mandatory. The duty to spy, as it were, is a duty to reduce epistemic uncertainty as far as possible when it comes to foreign policy decision-making. And this point is of particular relevance to recent policy discussions on Ukraine, as well as following the US and coalition withdrawal from Afghanistan and the resulting emphasis on over-the-horizon drone surveillance and targeting capabilities. The latter issue, I should clarify, is beyond the scope of Cecile's book, which focuses on intelligence collection and analysis rather than special operations, but it nevertheless provides a salient example of how intelligence may be used and the moral considerations at stake. From my own policy work, one relevant example concerns whether political communities are morally permitted or even obligated to collect intelligence that will prevent or stop terrorist threats. In making the decision to use force, for example, policymakers are often concerned about epistemic thresholds for causing harm, whether near or reasonable certainty is a sufficiently rigorous standard both for ensuring that a target is liable to be killed, that is, that they have done something to lose their right not to be killed, and that people who are innocent in the relevant sense will not be disproportionately harmed as a side effect of such operations. In intelligence speak, policymakers want to have medium to high confidence in intelligence reporting, ideally based on multiple reporting streams, before taking policy actions that are likely to result in civilian harm. The problem, which Cecile alludes to in the chapter on mass surveillance, is that even intelligence activities which are intended to protect fundamental rights may ultimately undermine such rights when they create or entrench unfair inequalities or patterns of domination within the international system. Suppose that, following the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the United States and its coalition partners have to maintain continuous drone surveillance over large swaths of the country in order to guard against resurgent threats from transnational terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS. On the normative account I've just described, it seems states have a moral obligation to collect information which could protect civilians from unjust terrorist attacks. The Afghan people, however, have not consented to this continuous surveillance. The Taliban, as far as we know, have not given such consent, and even if they did, they are not the elected representatives of the people. Nor is it clear that Afghans would consent to such surveillance if given the opportunity to do so, particularly in the wake of the botched August 29th drone strike in Kabul that mistakenly killed an innocent aid worker and his young family. Sometimes the intelligence is wrong, incomplete, or outdated. Sometimes analysts and algorithms suffer from confirmation bias based on prejudice and flawed assumptions. So continuous surveillance, even surveillance aimed at some way in protecting the Afghan people, holds ordinary Afghans at perpetual risk. The risk that their rights will be violated, whether that's the right to privacy or more fundamentally the right not to be killed, given the dual-use nature of drone technology for both surveillance and targeting purposes. The fact that ordinary Afghans should have to bear this risk on behalf of protecting others from transnational terrorist threats may also be unfair insofar as it imposes a greater share of protective burdens on them than, say, people living in the United States or Europe. We have to take these concerns seriously, as Cecile does, and think more deeply about how to balance the moral duty to spy with the moral imperative not to subject certain groups of people to ever more subtle yet pernicious forms of domination. Institutional processes can be improved, and intelligence standards must be strengthened, two areas which are beyond the remit of this excellent book, but which it nevertheless prompts us to consider as we move from the realm of applied ethics to ethical policymaking. I will close with one final thought, perhaps for the discussion period. It struck me in reading the book that some intelligence activities are problematic, not because they violate any fundamental rights at a particular point in time, but because they pose a continual risk that such rights will be violated in the future, often without warning. The fact that intelligence operations can take several years or even decades of planning further underscores the risk that just operations may become unjust over time. And Cecile acknowledges this issue, but I think the risks are particularly acute when it comes to intelligence gathering technologies, which are inherently dual use insofar as they can be used for espionage or attack purposes. One of the problems with cyber espionage, for example, is that the very same intrusion that facilitates the gathering of information can be used to conduct an attack with potentially kinetic effects. So engaging in cyber espionage, even when it is morally justified according to the framework that Cecile proposes, nevertheless entails certain moral risks. Access that was obtained initially for morally justified reasons ultimately may be used for morally unjustified ends. There is epistemic uncertainty, in other words, about how justifiably obtained access or intelligence will be used. In most cases, intelligence officers have little insight into this issue, which is considered to be the purview of policymakers. But if there is a duty to spy, as Cecile argues, then there must also be a duty to ensure that the information obtained from spying is used correctly, which is perhaps the subject of another book, but well worth thinking through in terms of the implications of this crucial research. I would now like to turn the conversation over to my colleague, Elod Uzon, to discuss his views on the book before we hear from Cecile again. Elod, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Brianna, for this lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak about Cecile's book. It's a great honor, and thank you, Cecile, for that gift that you gave us. I was reading and studying Cecile's work throughout my PhD, and I was always deeply impressed by her thought-provoking ideas and her ability to combine moral, political, and legal philosophy with real life and historical illustrations. Cecile, you mentioned the Kive and the Hobbes. I found another quote from Hobbes in the Leviathan, perhaps one of the most important works in political theory. Hobbes wrote that force and fraud are in war the two cardinal virtues. In a wonderful book, Cecile applies the experience and the knowledge achieved in many years of research into the ethics of both fields. Since espionage generally is not a matter of using force, we can wonder how relevant the relation between war and espionage is. So, Cecile makes a convincing case that espionage is closely related to the use of force, and thus to the ethics of and thus the ethics of espionage are closely related to the ethics of war. True, the right to life is usually not directly harmed by those who are victim of espionage, but many other basic rights, economic rights, the right to secrecy, the right to not to be coerced and duly are jeopardized. What is more, espionage often involves morally questionable means, as Brianna and Cecile mentioned, such as the use of traitors. So, as in the case of the use of force in war, when such basic human rights are violated, they can be only violated when there is a very good reason. Now, except for the last chapter, I will say a bit about it later. Cecile investigates the ethics of espionage when there is such a good reason. That is, in page 128, she investigates the ethics of espionage and counterintelligence operations against agents about whom there are reasons to believe, by dint of the role, the context within which they fulfill that role, and their conduct, that they might be engaged in an unjust foreign policy. This, Fabre argues, is the significant moral similarity between just espionage and just war. While it violates basic rights, it is sometimes justified as a reaction to unjust, aggressive foreign policy by others. Her argument for the permissibility of espionage under such conditions are, in my view, convincing. The ethics of espionage has been, for all intent and purposes, almost totally neglected by philosophers. Cecile's book remedied that omission. Now, perhaps this is because espionage and ethics seem contrary at first sight. But one could make similar claim about war and ethics. And indeed, there are some people who believe that war has nothing to do with ethics. If this book does no more than call attention to the urgent need for a philosophical and ethical investigation of the practice of espionage, it would be significant. But Cecile's book achieves much more. Espionage, like war, violates basic human rights. But no good is done by ignoring the fact that it is sometimes permissible or even required. Precisely because it is so potentially harmful, Fabre's careful investigation of the limits and details of espionage's permissibility is needed. the devil, as they say, is in the details. Espionage, like war for that matter, is a very general concept and can cover many different actions in many different situations. Another virtue of the book is in the systematic way in which Cecile investigates different facets of espionage, from using deception to the fact that espionage often involves treason, to economic espionage, to the ethics of recruiting spies, or the limits of coercing cooperation, and to the complex issue of cyber technology, in which SIGINT, which is a signal intelligence, gain information about the enemies in ways very different from than the traditional HUMINT, or human intelligence, method of spies, collaborators, and traitors. All of these subjects are dealt with in detail, with the basic moral problems of each type of espionage being made clear. Well, as both Brianna and the book itself shows, Cecile's does not shy away from controversial issues. The very project of writing a book that agrees that espionage is sometimes permissible or required is controversial. The most controversial subject in the book, I think, is probably chapter 9, mass surveillance, where, while being sensitive to the strong objections against it, Cecile argues that it is sometimes justified. This is perhaps a one-sentence summary of the general argument of the book. Objections to espionage, in general, to recruiting spies, to mass surveillance and other such acts, should be taken very seriously. But they are not strong enough to make all uses of espionage, recruitment, or mass surveillance morally forbidden or impermissible. And this is my overall impression of the book, that it is an adult or perhaps tragic view of espionage, if not of the human condition in general. We must take seriously, very seriously, that wrong that we must sometimes do, but not to shy away from the responsibility to sometimes do that wrong when a great benefit depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Elod. And now for a response from Cecile.
So I'd like to allow as much time for general Q&A, if that's okay. So I'll be brief. Let me first of all, thank both of you for your very kind words, about the book. I'm going to say a few things about each of your interventions in turn. So I think, Brianna, you are right to press me on two things, which. You press me on a number of things, but there are two, points of pressure, in your remarks, which I think you're right, to apply pressure there, and I should have said more, about this, in the book. I'm not planning to write another book, on this, so this is it. So the first is that, as you pointed out, particularly, with reference to the use of cyber espionage, the first is that. Even if, when we begin to use, this particular technique, as it were, it seems that the harm that we inflict on the other side is fairly minor, i.e., working out where this email, is sent to, minor enough to be justified in the grand scheme of things, as it were, by the ends which we seek to pursue, i.e., stopping a terrorist network. Over time, the cumulative impact of those many kinds of harm being inflicted, will really begin to bite, and we have to ask ourselves, whether over time we are morally justified in doing this. So it's one thing to say, well, look, all we need, by using cyber espionage is to find out, whether those 5 people who we suspect, are linked to terrorist networks, really are linked to those networks, and in order to do this, we track down, their movements by hacking into their smartphones. We check, whom they send emails to. But it's okay. I mean, it's just a bunch of emails. It's only 5 people, and we have strong reasons to suspect that they are linked to terrorist networks, which we think is going to plan an attack on our soil. we can do this. The harm we inflict is proportionate to the good that we are going to bring about. Well, over time, the harm will become much greater than that. So when GCHQ hacks into the phone of one person, they might end up gathering information about 20 people, on that person's list of, contacts. They will then find out more information about those 20 people, about whom they will unearth an extra 10 further contacts each. And the worry here, to repeat, is about the cumulative impact of what we do, to the point where it might seem disproportionate. And I don't talk enough about this in the book, and I should have done. Now, there's an interesting question here, which is whether or not the point that you made, and which I've just rehearsed, is specific to cyber espionage, because of the way cyber espionage does, or whether we should have that worry about cumulative impact about espionage in general. And it seems to me that we should have it about espionage in general. So that's an important point that would warrant further reflection. The second point of pressure, from your presentation, has to do with the use to which the information intelligence agencies, gather is put. Is it well used? In fact, sometimes it's not used at all, with devastating consequences, in fact. And again, there is more to be said about this than I say in the book. I think it's a very, very difficult question. It feeds into the critique that espionage is completely useless because it's inefficient, because intelligence agencies do not manage to get the information that governments need, or they get information that they believe governments wants to have, but which in fact is misleading. So the case of Iraq, and the months leading up to the invasion in 2003, is a case in point. Or they do get the right kind of information, but nothing is done. And here, I think it's fair to say, I'd be interested to know what you think, but it seems fair to say that certainly British and American intelligence agencies had worked out in the autumn that there would be an invasion of Ukraine, by the end of the winter. The French were not that convinced, but it looks as if the British and the Americans had it right. Nothing was done, preemptively. Now, the question is, what follows from this from a moral point of view? I mean, do we want to say, well, therefore, it's so useless that we ought not to have intelligence agencies in the first instance? So is the implication of that worry, an abolitionist, implication? Dismantle MI5, dismantle MI6, get rid of, the CIA, because, we can't trust, our leaders to use the information. Well, I'm not convinced that we should do that. In fact, I'm convinced that we shouldn't. That there is enough evidence that at least sometimes, it is done well, and it will save lives, and will lead to better decision making. Let me now turn very briefly to Elod's comments. So I want to begin by observing that the tone, it's interesting, I mean, the tone of your remarks does not cohere with what I take myself to be saying in the book. I'll explain why in a second. But I now wonder whether I express myself as well as you should have done. You said repeatedly, and I found that really, really interesting, you said, well, in a way, that this book, ends on a tragic note about espionage. We have to do wrong, in order, to do right. And I find it interesting that you should have seen the book this way, because that is not how I framed it or intended to frame it. So my view is not we have to do wrong in order to do right. My view is that sometimes we have to harm in order to do right. But those harms are not necessarily wrongful, for the fact that they are harmful, to other people. Now, you might think it's a distinction without a difference, but it's not. I think there is a very, very important distinction between saying, on the one hand, yes, I will harm you in order to do right, but I'm morally entitled to do it, and moreover, you have no grievance against me, for doing it. You have forfeited your claim against me that I not harm you. That is the position that I want to defend in the book, at least for most espionage cases. There is a difference between saying this on the one hand and saying on the other hand, I have to harm you in order to do right, and in harming you, I wrong you, so that there is a residual moral grievance, which in turn imposes on me a duty to apologize to you, for what I did to you. Now, in some cases, that is what happens, with espionage, indeed with war, but in many cases, it really isn't. At the risk of sounding, I know this is filmed, but at the risk of sounding extraordinarily controversial and of exposing myself to withering, criticisms, on the relevant platforms, if it is indeed the case that in order, I have to weigh my words very, very carefully here, if it is indeed the case, I'm agnostic on this point, that in order to stop the war in Ukraine, someone has to be willing to assassinate President Putin, if that is indeed the case as a matter of fact. And if it is indeed the case that assassinating President Putin would be harmful to him, and I agree that it would be harmful, to him. Not everybody thinks that, but I do believe it would be harmful to him. It simply does not follow that he would be wronged as a result. It simply does not follow that the assassins would have committed a wrong in order to do a right. Whether political assassination is wrongful is a separate question which has to be investigated in its own terms. And I think I will leave it at that.
Well, I want to save ample room for Q&A. So just 1 minute, Elod, if there's anything that you'd like to come back on with that, and then we can open it up to the floor.
Yeah, I would just say that perhaps to clarify my note is that I don't think you are absolutist in the sense that it's in many cases it is hard for us to think about abominable actions that we must do, but sometimes we must do these. Let's say, I'm not speaking now about people who are liable to be harmed, but if you need to be harmed, one innocent person, in order to save the life of 1,000, many of us would say that we should do it, even though the innocent has no liability, because numbers count. So if you think that, you are not an absolutist, which is, I think, the correct moral view. The question is, of course, how to analyze more complicated real life cases once we've passed the threshold that we are not absolutists.
Right, good. Yeah, that's fair. Thank you.
And for my part, my concern is not so much that the intelligence would be useless, but rather that it would be misused given all of the various players involved. So when we talk about the morality of espionage, we think of it as kind of one unitary thing, but actually there are so many different players and actors involved in just collecting one piece of intelligence that we have to look at the morality of each of these actions in the recruitment cycle, in the intelligence cycle. So the morality of a case officer recruiting an asset and his actions or her actions in doing that, the morality of an analyst assessing the information, the morality of policymakers deploying that information to a certain end. I think these are all different pieces that have to be looked at, but it raises the issue of that these large, particularly large intelligence gathering infrastructures, which are very powerful, like in the United States and the United Kingdom, that have these vast technical tools and other collection tools at their disposal, it raises the question for me about whether people in power have to have some kind of legitimate authority, not in the Westphalian sense of the term, but in the Rawlsian sense of the term, in the sense that in wielding this great power, we want to make sure that the people who do so possess certain virtues, such as the practical wisdom to discern where the moral boundaries of espionage and counterintelligence lie. And that strikes me as something that's very difficult, as we've seen with this discussion. So it's quite important to ensure that those in charge of these types of programs possess those virtues. But I want to turn to the audience in the time remaining. If you have a question, please state your name and affiliation along with the question. And but before doing that, let me just first exercise my prerogative as chair to ask a question which I think is quite relevant to the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I'm curious as to your thoughts, Cecile. So we've seen recent media reports suggest that the United States is sharing intelligence with Ukraine on Russian military intentions, plans, and positions. Does the moral duty to spy extend to a moral duty to help others to spy and or to share sensitive intelligence with third parties? To what extent are political communities permitted or even morally obligated to share such intelligence, particularly when they cannot control how the information will be used?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, it arose very acutely during the Second World War, as well, where the Allies, I beg your pardon, the British and the Americans had to decide how much to share, with the Soviets, given well-grounded worries, as it happens, that Soviet intelligence agencies had been penetrated by German, intelligence officers as well. So my view is that there is a pro tanto, duty, to share, but with a huge number of caveats. So to do, for example, to repeat with, risks of, one's intelligence partners, being penetrated, by, the enemy, risks that the intelligence will not be used properly or will be used by our partners in morally objectionable ways. So yes, but it's the unsatisfactory answer, to the question. I mean, it's unsatisfactory because it seems to me that one cannot go any further than what I have just done in abstraction of the specific details, of any given case. We also need, and I would agree with you, we need an account of, the virtues of decision makers, in this particular domain. So yes.
Absolutely. And now we can open it up for questions from the audience.
Well, she used to be. So we have proof of concept here. It's
I've been converted.
it's a wonderful question. So I have had conversations about this material with former intelligence officers, and in fact, as I say in the acknowledgement to the book, I'm not at liberty to say who they are, what they did. I can't even acknowledge in footnotes, the precise points that they have made, because of obvious, reasons of confidentiality. What I have found is that, whenever I've had a conversation with, in fact, actual intelligence officer as well as former intelligence officer, they've been very, very engaged. Point one. Point two, I should say, for the sake of transparency, that I've had conversations with British and intelligence, members of intelligence communities, not outside, those two countries, which may explain what I'm about to say. What has been very striking to me is that there is a sense in which nothing that I say in the book comes as a huge surprise, to them. I was surprised to see this, at first. So there is a sense in which, and it's a bit discomforting, when you spend 5 years of your life, writing a book, there is a sense in which for them I was, pushing through, open doors. Now the key question, so let me give you an example. I say in the book that there are very, very serious moral objections to sexual entrapment, right? So the honey trap. This is really a James Bondish, case. And, my interlocutors, would say, well, we don't do this. Okay, maybe the Soviets, did, maybe the Russians did. We don't do this. What's the problem? right? So the challenge for us academics, is twofold. One, to try and show why it is nevertheless important, to think about, those things. Two, to try and see in conversation with those interlocutors how whatever we say as philosophers, I say we, it's not the real we, but those of us who work on war, have the same problem, how we can try and help ensure that the moral norms that we define are properly articulated in various professional codes of conduct. And that's very hard to do. You have to have the right contact, you have to find the right, people, and so on and so forth. I had similar experiences when talking about the ethics of war, proper, not the ethics of espionage, and you must have had that as well.
Yeah, it's a very, very unfortunate, actually, phenomena in which philosophers, generally academic philosophers, they don't like to engage, I think, with military, with the militaries. There is a good reason for this distance. I think academics should remain a bit distant from the military, because there is always a danger that you will adopt the military's point of view, which they might be the militaries. I mean, militaries in liberal democracies can be interested, and they are frequently are interested in ethical questions, but they have other issues more important. So I think that the divide between practical ethics as the ethics of war and the military is wrong, you don't have and you should not adopt the military's point of view. But I don't think any good would be achieved by disregarding the actual life and dilemmas of real soldiers.
Do you find the same with intelligence community?
Yeah, I would say as someone who's worked in national security for quite a long time and only recently moved to academia, I was always quite impressed by Cecile's book, by how well she really grasps the dilemmas, the real ethical dilemmas that people face on a daily basis. And I think the moral intuitions in the book are actually incorporated to a certain extent in professional codes of conduct and training courses and things like this. But as I was saying to Cecile right before the talk, I think that there's much more that could be done based on this book. And what I'd really like to see in terms of the implications of the research and the practical application is to go beyond mere professional codes of conduct and really develop normative training courses based on the ethics of espionage in the same way that soldiers are trained in just war theory, for example. And to my knowledge, that nothing like that really exists, and it could be much more formalized and structured. And Cecile is welcome to lead it anytime she wants.
We academics face those dilemmas all the time. I get lots of emails, from students from China, who have secured a scholarship, to come and study, at Oxford, and every time I have to ask myself that very same question. So, there is no easy answer there, but one way to think about it, is by asking ourselves the following question. So, whenever we make a decision to say no, we risk unjustly depriving someone, of an opportunity. So the question is whether it is better to err on the side of risking unjustly depriving someone of an opportunity, for the sake of, protecting ourselves from espionage activities, or is it better to err on the side of unwarrantedly opening ourselves up to espionage activities, but for the sake of not depriving someone unjustly of an opportunity? And I do not have an answer, I'm afraid, to this particular question. What I do think, however, is this. I haven't thought about this issue in quite those terms, so I might fumble, a little bit. I apologize. It seems to me that, when we, institutions and individual academics working in the institutions have to make those decisions, it pays to ask ourselves not just what harm, we might cause, to the scholars, and what level of protection we thereby give ourselves. I think it is worth asking ourselves whether there are benefits that we could derive from taking that risk. The students whom we are educating today, are the diplomats and political leaders, of tomorrow. And it seems to me that, at least in some cases, these are relationships that we might want, to foster. This actually gives me an opportunity to say, in a way, of the topics that I cover in the books, which one I found the most interesting? The one I found the most interesting is treason. Most people think that treason is really, really bad. I argue in the book that under some conditions it's morally justified. Now, quite often, the people whom intelligence agencies recruit and encourage us to commit treason by passing on information to us are people who will have had positive experiences, our communities. So, some of the Russian Soviet spies of the Cold War are exactly, in that category. So the thought here is this. It's a very self-interested thought. But the thought is, if we, as a political community, want to benefit, further down the line, from having access, to information that we need, about those other countries, we don't want to cut off links completely, here and now. In other words, there are two moral issues. One is the harm that we do to those individuals, but the second one is, the harm that we will allow ourselves to suffer by depriving ourselves of an opportunity to foster better, most trustful relationships with those individuals in 10, 15, 20, 25 years.
I think your question actually raises a very interesting point, which is that in war, what we've seen is an increased blurring of the line between civilians and combatants, given the rise of non-state actor conflicts and transnational threats. I think we've seen something very similar in the intelligence and information realm, where there's this increased blurring of the line between traditional, shall we say, espionage activities and journalism, media, information, disinformation, and misinformation operations. All of these elements have blurred together to a much greater extent than ever before, given the rise of social media and all of the tools the technical tools at our disposal today, as well as, of course, the use of intelligence services, use of private contractors and journalists and other things like that. And so it raises a very interesting point about drawing the lines of these moral theories. And I think, in war, we have this presumption of civilian status unless proven otherwise, unless there's some sign, such as carrying a weapon or being directly engaged, directly participating in hostilities, that there should be that presumption of civilian status unless an individual is in fact directly participating in hostilities. And I think something similar, by analogy, might apply to espionage, where we should have this presumption that people are not spies unless there's some other indication to the contrary. But it's a very difficult question in today's media landscape in particular. And one thing that we haven't touched on today is, in fact, disinformation and misinformation and the morality of those issues. I don't know if we have time, if Cecile wants to say anything about that, but clearly a very complex moral issue, particularly with the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't have very well developed views, on this. Partly because, I'm not an absolutist, as Elad pointed out. So, I don't take the view that deceiving is always morally wrong. In a way, life is easier if you're an absolutist, right? You've got your absolutist positions. You don't really have to think about nuances and so on. That makes it harder when you're not an absolutist to work out a plausible position on fake news, for example. So I do, I need to think more about that. In a way, the deception operation that the Allies conducted in the Second World War were fake news, operations. Have you seen the movie Operation? You know what this is, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, it's Montague. So he's. It's a fascinating family. The brother set up the. I'm a table tennis fanatic. The brother of the naval officer was the founder of the International Table Tennis Association, as well as an inveterate communist. But that's a separate. Yeah. No. Okay. Great. So I need to go and see it. I love these books. I think they're amazing. So.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to think about it further, because I'm not sure if the arguments on deception in the book would translate directly to misinformation and disinformation, given the large scale, typically, of those operations and how difficult it is to control the impact, impossible really, to control the impact of the deception at the initial point in time that it's conducted.
Right. So your point, I know we have to stop soon, but so your point is that the medium by which those operations of disinformation are conducted today, i.e. social media platforms, the speed with which those fake bits of news are spread, and the massive numbers of people who are taken in, suggests that we have a qualitative difference, as it were, between disinformation, deception nowadays, on the one hand, and what our predecessors were able to do in the Second World War, so that even if it was morally okay in the Second World War, we can't infer that it's morally all right, here today. Well, that seems plausible, to me. Yeah, that's good.
Perhaps a topic for another day. But thank you so much for coming today. It was a pleasure to be with you all. And thank you, Cecile, for making this incredibly important contribution to the literature.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you.